December 7, 1941. Before dawn breaks over the Pacific, the ocean is calm. Almost unnaturally so. Steel decks cut silently through the water. Aircraft carriers move in disciplined formation, their lights dark, radios quiet. On their decks, pilots wait beside machines already warmed, already armed. This moment has been rehearsed for months down to the minute, down to the angle of the sun. Far away, in Hawaii, the morning begins like any other Sunday. Radios play music. Harbor crews prepare for inspection. Battleships sit anchored in neat rows, their massive guns pointing nowhere in particular. The United States is not at war. Not yet. In Tokyo, planners believe this strike will decide everything. One devastating blow. One shattered fleet. One message sent so clearly that America will choose negotiation over endurance. It is not rage that drives the operation. It is certainty. Certainty that the enemy lacks patience. Certainty that industry cannot recover fast enough. Certainty that morale will collapse before production can begin. The planes lift off. Engines roar into the darkening sky, and with them travels a single assumption, one that will shape the entire war. A belief that America will not fight back for long. That belief is about to collide with reality. By the time Japanese aircraft rose from their carriers in December 1941, the world had already been at war for more than 2 years. Europe was burning. Asia had been bleeding even longer. Japan's road to conflict did not begin with America. It began with ambition. During the early 1930s, Japan transformed itself into a militarized empire driven by scarcity. The home islands lacked oil, iron, ore, rubber, and many of the raw materials required to fuel modern warfare. Expansion was not framed as conquest, it was framed as survival. Each territory taken was described as a necessary step toward economic security. In 1931, Japanese forces moved into Manchuria. By 1937, full-scale war erupted in China. Cities fell, supply lines stretched, casualties mounted. Yet Tokyo did not slow down. Each success reinforced the belief that speed and decisiveness could overcome material limitations. But war consumes more than it captures. By the late 1930s, Japan's campaigns were draining fuel and steel faster than occupied territories could replace them. The longer the war in China continued, the more dependent Japan became on foreign imports, especially oil from the United States. This dependency was not lost on Washington. As Japanese forces advanced deeper into Asia, American policy hardened. First came export restrictions, then came embargoes. Aviation, fuel scrap, metal, eventually oil. Each measure tightened the pressure. Each signaled that Japan's expansion had crossed an unacceptable line. By mid-1941, Japanese stockpiles told a grim story. At current consumption rates, oil reserves could sustain the military for little more than a year. After that, aircraft would remain grounded. Ships would sit idle. The empire would suffocate without a single enemy shot fired. Inside Japan's leadership, debate intensified. There were voices urging restraint. Diplomats warned that war with America meant a conflict of production, not bravery. A conflict measured in factories, not battles. But those voices were increasingly drowned out by officers who believed delay was death. The logic was stark. Withdraw from Asia and lose everything already gained, or strike south, seize resource-rich territories, and neutralize any force capable of stopping it. That force was the United States Pacific Fleet. The decision that followed was not impulsive. It was calculated. War planners did not believe they could defeat America outright. They believed something far more specific and far more dangerous. They believed America could be shocked into submission if the fleet was crippled, if losses were heavy enough. If the war began with humiliation rather than sacrifice, then Japan could fortify its new empire, dig in, wait, and negotiate from a position of strength. It was a plan built on timing, precision, and a profound misunderstanding of the world they were about to awaken. And that misunderstanding began with how Japan saw America itself. In Tokyo, the United States was studied carefully and, yet, fundamentally misunderstood. Japanese planners did not view America as weak. They viewed it as soft. From their perspective, American society appeared divided, consumer-focused, and unprepared for sustained sacrifice. The memory of the First World War loomed large. A late entry, a short engagement, and a rapid return to isolation. Too many in Japan's military elite. America lacked the cultural endurance required for a long, brutal conflict across thousands of miles of ocean. This belief was reinforced by intelligence filtered through bias. American political debates were interpreted as indecision. Labor disputes were mistaken for instability. Racial segregation and economic inequality were seen as signs of a society that would fracture under pressure. What Japan saw was noise. What it failed to see was capacity. At the center of this miscalculation stood the United States Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor was not chosen simply because it was important. It was chosen because it was symbolic. Destroy the battleships, cripple the carriers, shatter the illusion of security. The assumption was that public outrage would be intense but brief, that anger would demand retaliation, but losses would temper ambition. Japanese war planning revolved around a single critical window. 6 months. 6 months to expand southward. 6 months to seize oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. 6 months to build an impregnable defensive perimeter stretching from the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia. After that, Japan believed America would calculate costs and choose compromise. This belief shaped everything from ship construction to pilot training. Japan invested heavily in elite naval aviators, men trained through long, rigorous programs. They built superb aircraft optimized for range and agility. What they did not build was depth. The assumption was simple. The war would be decided before replacement mattered. Industrial comparisons were available. Some officers understood that American shipyards outproduced Japan many times over, that American automobile factories could be converted to tank and aircraft production with alarming speed. But these facts were rationalized away. Numbers did not fight wars, they argued. Spirit did. And spirit, it believed, belonged to Japan. What Japan underestimated was not American anger but American organization, the ability of a democratic society to mobilize, standardize, and endure. The willingness of civilians to accept rationing. The speed at which factories could multiply output once political hesitation vanished. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically. Battleships burned. Aircraft were destroyed. Hundreds were killed in a single morning. Strategically, however, the attack achieved the opposite of its intent. It unified a divided nation. It erased isolationism overnight. It turned industrial potential into political will. The war Japan planned to end quickly had instead been given something far more dangerous: a clear beginning. And with that beginning came a contest. Japan was never prepared to fight, because from this moment forward, the war would no longer be decided by surprise but by scale. Japanese war strategy in 1941 was built around compression, short-time, rapid offensives, and decisive early blows. This approach had worked before, against China, against colonial garrisons in Southeast Asia. Speed had overwhelmed resistance before coordination could catch up. Against America, the same logic was fatally flawed. Japan planned for a conflict lasting no more than 1 year. Operational timetables were designed to peak early, then stabilize. The assumption was not victory in the traditional sense, but exhaustion, forcing Washington to choose negotiation over escalation. What this ignored was geography. The Pacific Ocean did not shorten the war. It lengthened it. Every mile increased American reliance on logistics, and logistics favored the nation with more ships, more fuel, and more factories. Japan's strategy created momentum but could not sustain it. By choosing a short war, Japan had committed itself to a long one. Angle 2. Cultural misreading of American society. Japanese leaders often described America as a nation unwilling to suffer, a place where comfort had replaced discipline and individualism weakened collective resolve. This view was shaped by selective observation and By projection, Japan assumed that democratic debate signaled fragility, that internal disagreement would paralyze decision. What they failed to understand was that debate ended once war was declared. The attack unified Americans across class, region, and ideology. Labor disputes vanished. Political divisions narrowed. What Japan interpreted as softness became resilience once purpose was clear. Morale did not collapse. It hardened. Angle 3. Industrial blindness. Perhaps the most catastrophic underestimation was industrial. In 1941, American industrial output already surpassed that of all Axis powers combined. Yet Japanese planners believed quality would outweigh quantity. Superior pilots, superior tactics, superior spirit. Factories, they assumed, could not compensate for battlefield losses quickly enough. They were wrong. Wheaton Mods, American shipyards, were launching vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Aircraft production accelerated 2 levels previously considered impossible. Training pipelines expanded, producing pilots faster than combat could eliminate them. Japan had prepared for excellence. America prepared for replacement. And in a war of attrition, replacement is everything. These 3 misjudgments, strategy, culture, and industry, did not operate in isolation. They reinforced one another, creating a logic so internally consistent that warning signs were dismissed rather than addressed. The consequences of that logic would soon move from planning rooms to open water, because theories collapse when confronted by combat, and the Pacific was about to test every assumption Japan had made. At the center of Japan's naval planning stood Isoroku Yamamoto, a commander who understood America better than most of his peers. Yamamoto had studied in the United States. He had seen its factories, its railroads, its cities. Privately, he warned that Japan could run wild for only a short time before American power became overwhelming. Yet even Yamamoto operated within constraints. Japanese military culture rewarded decisiveness and punished hesitation. Once political leaders chose war, the task of the Navy was not to question the premise but to execute it perfectly. Planning focused on tactical brilliance rather than strategic sustainability. Success was defined by early victories, not long-term equilibrium. Across the Pacific, American leadership evolved differently. Initial shock gave way to clarity. Command structures were reorganized. Authority was delegated. Learning was rapid. Mistakes were studied, not hidden. Leadership became adaptive rather than rigid. And in modern war, adaptability outlasts certainty. Angle 5. Technology, doctrine, and the carrier revolution. Japan entered the war with some of the most advanced naval aviation in the world. Its carrier pilots were highly trained. Its aircraft, particularly long-range fighters and torpedo bombers, were optimized for offensive reach. But doctrine mattered as much as hardware. Japanese naval thinking still centered on the decisive fleet battle, single climactic engagement that would settle the war. Technology was shaped to serve that vision. Aircraft carriers were tools to weaken the enemy before that final confrontation. America learned faster. Radar integration, damage control, and decentralized command turned carriers into independent striking forces rather than supporting assets. Losses were analyzed. Procedures were standardized. Technology was paired with process. Japan's technological edge narrowed quickly. America's widened. What began as superiority became peritone, then imbalance. Angle 6. The human cost behind the calculations. Beneath strategy and steel were people. Japanese pilots trained for years, but replacements were rushed once losses mounted. Veterans fell faster than they could be replaced. Experience drained away. Young men were sent into combat with fewer hours, fewer chances to survive. American losses were no less real. Sailors died in burning ships. Airmen vanished into the ocean. But training pipelines expanded. Survivors were rotated, studied, and redeployed. One system consumed its people. The other regenerated them. By 1943, the imbalance was visible in the air. Not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because courage cannot substitute for time, fuel, and repetition. War had moved beyond heroism. It had become arithmetic. And the numbers were turning. These Angle-Sidor ship limits, technological adaptation, and human sustainability did not reveal themselves all at once. They emerged gradually, battle by battle, loss by loss. Japan still held territory, still struck hard, still believed the decisive moment lay ahead. But beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. Because the war Japan hoped to conclude early was now entering a phase it had never planned for, a phase defined not by surprise but by end. In the months following December 1941, Japan appeared unstoppable across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Japanese forces advanced with precision and speed. American, British, and Dutch positions collapsed in rapid succession. Airfields were overrun, naval bases fell, garrisons surrendered after brief resistance or were bypassed entirely. The early phase of the war unfolded almost exactly as Japanese planners had predicted. The fall of the Philippines isolated American forces in the Western Pacific. Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, collapsed in February 1942. The Dutch East Indies followed, bringing with them the oil fields Japan desperately needed. For a moment, the empire's economic problem seemed solved. On maps in Tokyo, the defensive perimeter expanded outward like a tide. From the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, Japanese flags marked territory seized in less than 6 months. Each new victory reinforced the belief that the gamble had paid off. But beneath the surface, the victories carried hidden costs. Aircraft losses mounted faster than expected. Veteran pilots were killed in numbers that training programs could not replace. Ships damaged in combat often required months of repair, months Japan could not afford. Fuel consumption surged as fleets operated farther from home ports. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, something profound was happening. The United States was not hesitating. It was reorganizing. American industry shifted gears with unprecedented speed. Civilian factories were converted almost overnight. Shipyards expanded. New carriers slid into the water while Japanese planners were still calculating the impact of the last battle. Training programs scaled up, sacrificing perfection for throughput. The war was already changing character. Japan continued to search for the decisive encounter, the battle that would finally break American resolve. Every operation was framed as a step toward that moment. The assumption remained unchanged. One more shock, one more loss, and the enemy would negotiate. But America was no longer reacting emotionally. It was learning. American commanders began to choose when to fight and when to withdraw. Intelligence improved. Code-breaking advanced quietly in the background. Losses were studied, not concealed. Each setback became a lesson rather than a verdict. The balance had not yet shifted. Japan still struck hard, still controlled vast territory, still believed time favored those with the will to seize it. Yet the war was slipping out of the shape Japan had designed. What was meant to be a single opening blow had become a chain of commitments. Each new victory demanded garrisons, fuel, ships, and men. The perimeter grew wider and thinner, and somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon of early success, waited the confrontation that would decide whether Japan's assumptions could survive contact with an enemy that refused to collapse. That confrontation was no longer theoretical. It was approaching. The decisive shift did not arrive with a single explosion. It arrived with a realization. By mid-1942, Japanese commanders still believed they were drawing the American fleet into the long-awaited decisive battle. Operations were planned to extend the defensive perimeter and force engagement on Japanese terms. The objective was clear: destroy the remaining American carriers, remove the final obstacle, and secure the empire's gains. What Japan did not fully grasp was that America now understood the battlefield better than Japan realized. Quietly, American intelligence had begun to penetrate Japanese communications. Patterns emerged. Timetables became visible. Movements that once relied on secrecy now unfolded under informed observation. The Pacific was still vast, but it was no longer opaque. American commanders adjusted. Instead of reacting to Japanese initiatives, they anticipated them. Forces were positioned not to contest every advance, but to strike where Japanese losses would be irreplaceable. Aircraft carriers, once viewed as supporting assets, became the central instruments of decision. The confrontation that followed shattered Japan's operational confidence. Within days, 4 frontline Japanese carriers were lost ships that had taken years to build, crew, and train. Along with them went hundreds of experienced aviators. These were not losses that could be absorbed. They were structural fractures. Japan had expected an exchange. It suffered an amputation. For the first time, Japanese leadership confronted a truth they had postponed since 1941. The war could no longer be won on schedule. The decisive battle had arrived, but it had not delivered decisiveness. Instead, it exposed imbalance. From that point forward, the initiative shifted. American carriers returned to sea not as isolated units, but as components of an expanding system. New hulls appeared faster than Japanese planners could update their charts. Air groups arrived trained to standardized doctrine. Damage that would have crippled a Japanese ship was absorbed, repaired, and studied. Japan still fought fiercely. Operations continued in the Solomon Islands. Counterattacks were launched. Tactical brilliance did not vanish overnight, but the nature of the war had changed. Every Japanese sortie now carried disproportionate risk. Every loss cut deeper than the last. Every engagement reduced future options. The American approach was different. Time was no longer the enemy. It was the weapon. With each passing month, the industrial gap widened. Training pipelines matured. Logistics stabilized. Commanders rotated with experience intact. The United States no longer needed to gamble on decisive blows. It could grind. By late 1942, Japan's strategic imagination narrowed. Plans became reactive. Objectives shrank. The question was no longer how to win, but how to avoid collapse long enough to force a settlement. That settlement never came, because the war Japan had designed to be brief had transformed into something it could not endure. And once that transformation was complete, the outcome ceased to be uncertain. Only the cost remained to be determined. After the turning point, the war no longer moved in sweeping arcs. It advanced in increments measured in islands taken, airfields built, and tonnage moved across oceans. For Japan, the consequences of miscalculation became unavoidable. Carrier losses forced a strategic retreat from large-scale naval offensives. Fuel shortages returned despite early gains in Southeast Asia as American submarines tightened their grip on sea lanes. Merchant shipping thin even before the war began to disappear faster than it could be replaced. What Japan had seized, it now struggled to sustain. The defensive perimeter, once a symbol of confidence, became a liability. Each outpost required food, ammunition, aircraft, and men. Each demanded protection from air and sea. As American forces advanced, methodically choosy targets based on logistics rather than garrisons were bypassed and isolated. They remained armed, intact, and strategically irrelevant. Inside Japan's high command, optimism gave way to endurance planning. The language shifted. No longer was victory assumed. Instead, leaders spoke of inflicting enough casualties to make the war politically unacceptable for America. The objective narrowed from winning to prolonging. Strategy became delay. But delay favored the wrong side. American operations grew more precise. Amphibious doctrine matured. Air superiority was established step by step. Each captured island became a forward base, shortening supply lines for the United States, while lengthening Japan's what had once been a vast ocean buffer now worked in reverse. The human cost accelerated. Japanese pilots faced impossible odds against growing numbers of better-supported American aircraft. Training hours declined. Survivability plummeted. Losses that once would have shocked leadership became routine entries in reports. American losses were heavy as well, but they were absorbed into a system built for replacement. Ships damaged were repaired. Crews were rotated. Experience accumulated rather than vanished. By 1944, the disparity was no longer abstract. It was visible in the air, at sea, and on the ground. Battles that once hinged on tactical brilliance now hinged on supply tables and production schedules. Japan still fought with determination, still defended fiercely, still believed that honor required resistance regardless of odds. But the war had crossed a threshold. From this point on, every Japanese sacrifice delayed defeat but did not alter its direction. And as the pressure tightened, The consequences of the original assumption that America would not endure became tragically clear, because endurance was now the defining feature of the conflict. By the final year of the war, Japan was no longer fighting for advantage. It was fighting against momentum. American forces advanced across the Pacific with deliberate restraint, choosing targets that collapsed Japan's ability to respond rather than striking everywhere at once. Each operation shortened American supply lines while stretching Japan's beyond recovery. Airfields multiplied. Ports expanded. Radar networks tightened the net. Japan's industrial system, never designed for sustained total war, began to fail under blockade and bombardment. Oil shortages, grounded aircraft, factories slowed or stopped entirely. Cities burned as strategic bombing intensified, eroding both production and civilian morale. The gap Japan had dismissed in 1941 now defined every engagement. Where Japan had once relied on elite training and initiative, it now relied on improvisation. Aircraft were launched with minimal fuel. Pilots flew with fewer hours than their opponents had accumulated in training alone. Ships sailed without adequate escort. Each mission carried the knowledge that replacement was unlikely. American power, by contrast, expanded relentlessly. By 1945, the United States possessed overwhelming naval and air superiority. Its fleet was not merely larger, it was systematized. Losses no longer dictated strategy. They were accounted for, calculated, planned around. The war's end came not through negotiation, but through collapse. Japan's leadership, faced with total defeat and national destruction, confronted the consequences of the belief that had guided the war from its first day. The assumption that America would tire, that its society would fracture, that its industry would stall. None of it happened. Instead, the conflict transformed the United States into a global military-industrial power whose reach extended far beyond the Pacific. Japan emerged, devastated, cities ruined, its economy shattered, its empire dismantled. The cost was not abstract. Millions were dead across Asia and the Pacific. Entire regions were scarred. A generation was lost to a war driven not by inevitability, but by misjudgment. And at the center of that misjudgment lay a single idea that resolve could be measured by appearances rather than capacity. History would remember the battles. But the war had been decided long before the last shots were fired. It had been decided the moment endurance was underestimated. The Second World War in the Pacific was not decided by bravery alone, nor by intelligence, nor even by technology in isolation. It was decided by alignment, by how well a nation understood the kind of war it was entering. Japan entered the conflict believing that shock could replace endurance, that spirit could overcome scale, that a modern industrial democracy would calculate pain and choose retreat. America entered the war unwillingly, but, once committed, it transformed itself with rare speed and unity. Factories became arsenals. Citizens became participants. Debate became direction. The lesson was not that one culture was stronger than another. It was that war punishes assumptions more than it rewards confidence. Japan did not lose because it lacked courage. It lost because it fought the wrong war, one imagined through past victories rather than future realities. It planned for a decisive moment in a conflict that would be decided by time. In underestimating America, Japan underestimated something larger than an enemy. It underestimated modern warfare itself, a form of conflict where production eclipses valor, where systems outlast heroes, where victory belongs not to those who strike first but to those who can continue long after the first strike has faded. History does not remember this war as a sudden collapse. It remembers it as a slow, grinding consequence of choices made under pressure, of confidence hardened into certainty, of certainty exposed as illusion. And in that illusion lies a warning that extends beyond the Pacific, beyond the 1940s, and beyond any single nation. Because wars are not lost when battles are lost. They are lost when reality is misunderstood. The Pacific War was not decided by a single battle, nor by a single leader's mistake. It was decided by a pattern of assumptions, quiet, confident, and rarely questioned. Japan entered the war believing that resolve could be broken by shock, that a dramatic opening strike would substitute for time, that a society accustomed to comfort would recoil from sustained sacrifice. These were not careless ideas. They were reasoned conclusions drawn from limited observation and shaped by past experience. But modern war does not forgive incomplete understanding. Once committed, the United States did not fracture. It reorganized. Industry did not hesitate. It expanded. Political division did not paralyze action. It disappeared beneath a shared sense of purpose. What appeared slow before war became unstoppable after it began. Japan, by contrast, fought brilliantly within a framework too narrow to survive reality. It planned for excellence where endurance was required. It trained for decisive moments in a conflict governed by accumulation. It invested in elite skill without building systems to sustain loss. The result was not immediate defeat but inevitability. As months turned into years, the war exposed a truth that transcended ideology and culture. In industrial warfare, capacity is destiny. Courage determines how a nation fights. Systems determine how long it can continue. Japan's underestimation of America was not simply a misreading of an enemy. It was a misunderstanding of the era. It had entered an era where wars are won not by the opening blow, but by the ability to absorb, adapt, and outlast. The Pacific War ended with devastation on a scale neither side had fully imagined in 1941. Cities were destroyed. Societies were transformed. Power shifted permanently. And long after the guns fell silent, the lesson remained. Wars are not decided by how they begin. They are decided by what nations are capable of becoming once they are forced to continue. History does not punish ambition alone. It punishes certainty untested by reality. And in the Pacific, the price of that certainty reshaped the world.